All right, loud and clear. So it looks like we're a go. So appreciate Starting Strength for the invitation to have me on today. So I don't have a set topic today. They had asked if I wanted to speak on something in particular. Not really. I think what I'm going to do is just about an hour of Q&A. So I think that'll be the most valuable thing rather than listen to me rattle on about stuff. I'm just going to try to take as many questions as I can and give as good answers as I can in about the next hour or so. So we will get started, and I'm just going to kind of take them as I see them. Someone asked, is that the new shirt? Yes, that's one of my new shirts. I don't know how well you guys can see it, but I'm not big into the whole merchandise thing, but since we've all got a little extra time to kill, since our gyms are closed and we're not training people and that sort of thing, I went ahead and took the time to get some shirts made. So if you guys want any of my Baker Barbell Club shirts, I believe the best place to go is probably go to my Instagram, which is @BakerBarbell. And so you can go there. And if you want to give me a follow on my Instagram, and then also you can look in the link is there for shirts if you want to find it there. Okay. What is the average weight of your guys who hit 500, 400, 600? So I'm assuming that's 400 bench, 500 squat, 600 deadlift. Yeah, and as you said, everyone's different. I don't know that there is an average weight. That'd be almost impossible to answer. I will say the 500 squat and the 600 deadlift are quite a bit more common to achieve than the 400-pound bench. So you're going to see a lot less 400-pound benches than you will 500 squats, and then probably especially 600 deadlifts. So a lot of that has to do with build. There's definitely, I have a lot of lighter guys, that can hit the 600-pound deadlifts, that sort of thing, because it's a little bit easier based on your leverages. Whereas to climb up to a 400-pound bench takes a little bit more. So definitely for the 400-pound bench, north of 200 pounds is generally pretty standard. I don't think I've ever had a guy less than 200 pounds hit a 400-pound bench. But I've had a few, most of them, probably low to mid 200s, something like that have worked up over. Once you get into the higher 200-pound body weights, the 400 bench becomes, a bit more achievable. What is the second best state after Texas? That's a weird question. Actually, you'd probably be surprised to hear me say this, but actually California. So I guess just because I live there. So that was, I actually enjoyed Southern California quite a bit. I lived there for 4 years while I was active duty. So a lot of weirdos, of course, but it's a pretty cool state. Okay. What is your favorite memory with you and Rip? Let me come back to that one. I have to think about that one a little bit. There's quite a few. see. What do people tend to screw up the most on your templates and programs? Oh, that's a good one. And it's not just, that's just not my templates and programs. I'd say the most common mistakes that people make when they're following any program is to not plan it out and then see it through. So I just had this conversation the other day with some members on my Facebook group about that kind of trying to select which programming methodology to follow, which program to follow. Post novice, there's a lot of different options, and there's a lot of different things that can work. There's not necessarily one approach. Everybody's kind of always looking for that one optimal program that they can put together that's going to give them, the optimal amount of progress. But that's potentially achievable with a lot of different programming options. It's time to learn yourself and learn your tolerances, learn what works for you, learn what doesn't. And so part of what you're going to want to do as an intermediate is experiment a little bit with different programming methodologies, different exercise selections and that sort of thing. But also know that you have to put something together, and there's a bit of an unknown there. You can never figure everything out at the front end of a program and solve every possible problem. So you've just got to lay something out that's reasonable and then go with it. So whether that's 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 16 weeks or something, lay something out that seems reasonable to you based on your previous training experiences, based on all the information that you've gathered. Lay something out, know where your strength is going into it. So whether that's a 1 rep max or whatever, you have to have some sort of baseline to know kind of where you're at, and then have a date. It doesn't have to be an official meet, but some sort of testing date, whether it's by yourself in your garage or whatever, but some sort of test at the end to be able to weigh the effectiveness of the program or not. And then the most critical thing is to see it through. Because even if you choose something and lay it out and you get to the end of it and you test out and the results weren't so great and the progress wasn't, as profound as you hoped and thought it would be, the benefit is that you will have at least learned something about your own body. You'll have learned what worked and what didn't work. So typically what you'll see is on a lot of programs, guys will say, my squat and my deadlift did really well on this program and I progressed. I got, 20, 25 pounds, added to my max or whatever on this program, but my bench and my press didn't really move that much. Okay. Well, that's a data point you can use. You can say, okay, well, I did a Texas method program or a heavy, light, medium program or some sort of split routine. I mean, there's a million different ways to draw things out. And this approach worked really, really well for this lift or that lift, and not so good for this lift. And then you go back and you either run it again or you drop something similar or you make some changes, and you base it off of what worked and what didn't work. And if the more you repeat that process, the better you're going to get at programming for yourself, because you'll know, okay, this lift needs a ton of volume. I don't do well on my bench with a higher intensity approach. I need a lot of volume on my bench press. I need a lot of frequency on my bench press, whereas maybe the deadlift, not so much. Maybe I'm do better deadlifting once a week with less volume. Maybe the squat is somewhere in the middle. It's going to vary a little bit for everybody, but if you stop and start programs all the time. So I addressed this, years ago in a couple articles about chronic program hopping. In other words, I do something for 3 weeks. I don't really like the way it's going, so I stop and I just make a wholesale change to something else. I do that for a month and then I stop and then I do something totally different. Well, one, you're almost guaranteeing yourself that you're not going to make great progress when you program hop like that. Sometimes it gives the illusion that you're making progress, because when you stop and you try something new, it always feels like there's kind of an excitement to it or whatever. You may feel, good the initial couple of weeks, but most programs get harder in the middle and towards the end. And that's where you really got to, push through the end and see what the outcome is. If you program hop all the time, you're almost guaranteed to not make any really sustainable progress. But you also are never learning. You're never learning about what approach works for you and what doesn't. So even if you see something through to the end of 12 weeks, 16 weeks, regardless of what it is, whether it works really well or whether it doesn't, at least you'll have a good data point and a good learning experience from it. So then in the future, when you make a choice about what type of program to follow, you have a better filter. So you can look and say, oh man, this program has a lot of deadlift volume and a lot of deadlift frequency. And, I've done that approach several times and I really didn't make good progress on that, or I went backwards doing that. So your filter, you can just filter that out, or you can look at something and say, oh yeah, this looks a lot like this other thing that I did that worked really well. It's a little bit different, but it's along the same lines of what I've done in the past that worked for me. So I'm going to try this. Or, the ultimate goal is to be able to, put something together for yourself and program for yourself. And the more times you see things through and go back and objectively evaluate the results, the better you'll get at writing out programming for yourself, and not always having to rely on a template or, something like that. So that's the biggest thing is just pick something, that's reasonable. And that's the thing is a lot of people are afraid, well, what if it doesn't work? Most of the time, if it's reasonable, the worst case scenario is usually that you kind of stagnate. If you pick something that's really at the far end of one of the spectrum, then the chances of massive regression is higher. But on most kind of middle of the road programs, usually the worst case scenario is more of kind of a stagnation as far as in rather than the wholesale regression. So if you pick something that's further, really, really, really high on the volume side, or really, really low on the volume side, but really high on the intensity side. So something that's kind of swings really far one way or the other, then you run more of a risk of really regressing on your lifts. But generally the way I program for people, I usually, if I don't know them that well, and I didn't start with them as a novice, so I'm picking up a coaching client that's been training for a number of years and I really don't know them that well. I do a questionnaire, that sort of thing, but I don't know them. I usually start them out with kind of a middle of the road type approach. And that allows me to adjust it, kind of up or down based on the feedback that I'm getting. So the worst thing to do is just take a guess at somebody and say, okay, I'm going to throw a ton of volume at this person and see if it works. Because if it doesn't work, then you run the risk of, causing them to overtrain and maybe regress and get burned out really early into the program. And you can do the same thing on the other end of the spectrum of, pushing a program that's really, really, heavily intensity based and really low on the volume. Most people respond best to an approach that's somewhere middle of the road, not necessarily super high volume, not necessarily super low volume. But if you can start with a middle of the road approach and just progress it and then adjust it, every few weeks based on what's happening, that's a much, much easier approach to get people into a program that's right for them, and it's a lot less risky in terms of picking an approach that's totally wrong. So most people that go middle of the road, like I said, at worst, you'll kind of just stagnate, not make any progress, but necessarily go backwards. So there's that. Any recommendations for baseball players? There's a ton of anecdotal evidence that overhead lifts are bad. Your thoughts? I think that's dogma. That's stuck around in that world for a long time. I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of baseball players. I've worked with a lot of pitchers in particular. Now, you don't, with a baseball, especially a pitcher, you don't necessarily have to overdo the upper body stimulus. You don't need to crush them with a lot of volume or intensity on the upper body lifts. And that's just because they're putting so many repetitions on that arm, and a lot of these kids nowadays are practicing and taking pitching lessons and playing in these seasonal leagues and everything. They operate year round. And so you don't, especially with a pitcher, your focus is really going to be on the lower body. So, if you get a pitcher in there and he's got he doesn't have much of a squat, or, most of them don't have any squat at all. You teach them how to squat and you build up their lower body strength. And even if you just do kind of some maintenance level upper body stuff with them, you're going to get, some more juice on that fastball. And kind of the same thing with the, even with the position players. But in terms of the press being bad, there's nothing wrong with the movement itself. The only risk and you could do it with bench, the press, chins, anything, is just too much volume combined with the amount of practice and gameplay that they have. And that's true with any sport. Is when you're working with an athlete, you really have to look at all of the issues that you don't have control of as a strength coach. And so you have to look at how many times a week is this kid practicing? How hard are these practices? How many times a week is he engaging in actual competition, whether it's, games or anything like that. So, and then you have to balance what you're doing as a strength coach to make sure that you're adding to their performance as a player and not taking it away. So you always want to get them stronger, but you have to be careful how hard you push, in the gym in order to get them stronger, because with the kids, a lot of them, the high school, whether it's them or their parents or whatever, if they see that the training is taking away from their performance, they're too sore, or just they're getting more overuse type stuff because they're doing a lot of volume in the gym, plus a lot of the volume with the sports stuff, so you can overdo it with any of the upper body movements. But in terms of the press having mechanically anything wrong for the shoulders, I would say it's the opposite. I've worked with a lot of baseball players, but I've worked with lots and lots and lots of swimmers. So that was something that I kind of stumbled onto early in my career, was working with a lot of the high school and college swimmers around the Houston area. And I've probably seen dozens and dozens of these kids at the high school and college level, and they present a lot of times, even at a very young age, with a lot of shoulder issues, a lot of shoulder tendonitis, and that sort of thing. And these kids, a lot of times the parents have spent a lot of money on physical therapy and rehab type stuff, and they do a lot of work with their trainers, and they get no relief. And the first thing I do is, however many times a week they're going to come and see me, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 times a week, I will have them press every session, starting with something light, so whether it's an empty bar, or even whether it's a 45-pound bar or a light training bar, but I will have them press 3 sets of 5 every single session. And within a few weeks, usually that shoulder pain starts to clear up. And then that is a staple in the program, is overhead press, as kind of not only just a strength training tool, but also kind of a prehab type movement to prevent further pain and that sort of thing. So I am in 100% disagreement with the fact that overhead pressing should not be done with overhead athletes. It's just like anything, it's the amount that you do is important. So, but you could say the same thing for lower body, exercise. If you're working with a track and field athlete, you can certainly overdo the volume and the intensity of the squatting and deadlifting and that sort of thing that they do, just because the total workload that they're doing in the gym combined with all their sports stuff can just add up to be too much for them to recover from. And, the kids typically, their diet is garbage. A lot of them stay up too late and don't get enough sleep and that sort of thing. So you've got to weigh all that sort of stuff to make sure that you're adding value instead of taking it away. It was asked in another group for bench press assistance, close grip or incline. Oh, that's a tough call. I like them both. Those are probably my 2 favorite bench press assistance movements. I think probably right off the bat, close grips might help a little bit more, because people tend to be stronger on their close grip bench press when, like, let's say you have a guy never lifted before, or he's never done any assistance type movements before. He's just done, plain bench pressing and, kind of the big 4 squat, bench press, deadlift, and you start adding assistance movements to his routine. A lot of guys are not that much weaker on a close grip than they are on a regular bench press. So sometimes when that's the case, the effect from adding the assistance work is going to be a little bit more significant in the short term with movements that they're stronger on already, because there's less of a learning curve. So they get into having a more of a training effect, because they're able to use, there's less form issues, there's less technical issues. They're using heavier loads, so there's a potential to get more carryover in the short term. But so what happens a lot, like with incline presses especially, people really don't like that movement. I happen to love inclines personally, and I like them for clients, but just having worked with a lot of people, a lot of people don't like inclines when they're first introduced. It feels awkward to them, or it kind of aggravates their shoulder a little bit. Whatever the case is, the path feels weird to them. So it feels like a very awkward movement to them. And so because they're not technically proficient in the movement, the weights are going to be, pretty low compared to the bench press. And so at the beginning, there's not going to be that much carryover from working with it's like a guy that starts doing front squats for the first time. A lot of guys, they start their front squat really, really low compared to their back squat. It just doesn't have much carryover to the main lift until they become more technically proficient at the movement. Once they gain that technical proficiency in the movement, you start to see some like kind of novice-like gains. So you start to kind of get that novice effect on that movement to where they've got the technique dialed in. And so then it's kind of, they muddle through maybe the first couple of times they do it. But then after that, they start progressing really, really, really fast on it as they get adapted to the movement. Then it starts getting harder. And it, just like any other movement, the longer you do it, the harder it is to make progress on it. But I feel like once you start making that progress on the movement, once it gets hard, in other words, you've ironed out your technical issues and you've kind of got past, you've got all the gains that you're going to get out of kind of that novice effect from that new exercise. Then once you start to make what I call those hard gains, that's when it starts to carry over quite a bit more. So I feel like the incline is something that's definitely worth learning. I think it can add a lot of mass on the pectorals better than a close grip can. So if you're a guy that's, you can just look at yourself. If you don't have neck mass, your bench press is going to suffer. So, and a lot of guys find that in order to develop more pec mass, the bench press, especially if you bench more like a power lifter with a big arch, a wide grip, bringing the bar down, lower onto the torso, it's actually not that stimulative of movement for the pectorals. So doing like a close grip or an incline press, dips can be good. Working with dumbbells, that sort of thing for assistance type work can build up the pec mass, and potentially bring up a weakness. So in that regard, I really like inclines, for that. You talk to a lot of bodybuilders, and a lot of bodybuilders will use the incline as one of the primary chest movement because they feel like it's a better developer of the pecs than is a flat bench press. And a lot of that has to do with just the style in which you flat bench. So again, if you're more like a power lifter, a lot of times it's not that stimulative to the pec. So that the answer to that, I feel like probably short term, the close grip is better. Long term, potentially the incline is better. And also with the incline, you tend to get a lot more carryover to your press. So you kind of get a two for, if you're a guy that likes to track your bench press and your overhead press, the incline is a good kind of two for one movement because it'll have carryover to both. So yeah, I definitely like the incline press. What are the most difficult hurdles to becoming an SSC? Gaining experience, working with clients. It's easier to learn the material when you have more context. It would be very difficult to sit down with somebody who maybe has only trained themselves for years and then try to go through the SSC certification process. It would just be harder without a broader base of context, without having spent more time in the gym yourself, but also more time, working with clients and trying to apply the material to a wide range of different clientele. So, so it's kind of a catch-22 if you don't have, you don't necessarily have to have professional certification in order to build up a client base. But if you're waiting to get the SSC and then start your coaching practice after that, that's going to be harder. I would say if you want to become a starting strength coach, I would start your coaching practice now and start seeing as many clients as you can now, running people through, the novice progression, forms of intermediate level programming, coaching people in person over longer periods of time, just seeing people on occasion for form checks. Like that's one thing, but then handling somebody for a longer period of time where you're seeing them multiple times per week. So you're seeing in real time the entire process play out, and you're seeing that process play out over and over and over again with, young athletes, with 20 and 30-year-old guys, with men, with women, with older clients, with people with injuries and, all kinds of different psychological makeups and all that sort of thing. Like it's all different. And so the broader the base you can get in terms of the types of clients that you work with and the more repetition you can get working with more people, the easier it is going to be to internalize that material because you've seen it play out over again. And so then a lot of the stuff will make a little bit more sense to you. So there's no substitute for just working with people, and getting them stronger. And you put yourself on the line to where this stuff becomes a lot less theoretical, a lot more practical, to where you've actually seen, what works and what doesn't. I think I got certified as a starting strength coach in 2012. I want to say that was the year I got certified. But I had opened my gym in 2007. So I had already been seeing, and even before I opened my gym, I had worked as a coach for a while. So, but I had been doing it, full time, intensively, as a coach and a gym owner for 4 or 5 years before I ever even took the start strength exam. So it was the material was, it was not that mind blowing, whereas it might be to somebody that has never seen the process play out over again. What is the counterpart to starting strength in the nutrition department? I don't know exactly what that means in terms of whether it's who's the best nutrition guy, or the best type of kind of commercially available program out there. Honestly, in terms of, if you look at all the fad kind of named diets out there, and there's dozens, hundreds of them that have come and gone over the years. It's the one I feel like would work the best for an athlete that is looking for, a combination of, of performance and managing proper body composition, getting the requisite amount of protein in, the requisite amount of carbs, optimal amount of feeding times, and that sort of thing. If you look at some of you guys that are a little bit younger may not know what I'm talking about, but if you look at the old Bill Phillips Life program, that's actually a really good approach for a lot of people. It's a good starting place because it involves portion sizes instead of counting macros. And for a lot of people, that's going to be a really good place to start, is just getting the right amount of foods in approximately the right portions. I think people go way overboard with counting macros anyway. People get neurotic about it in terms of, I got to eat 13 blueberries or, whatever it is. You got to realize, like, that's a moving target even on a daily basis, because what we're trying to do is match our intake to our caloric expenditure, and your caloric expenditure varies day to day. So that's not like, that's going to be, it could potentially be, several hundred calories burned more or less day to day based on, your activity level, your training, that sort of thing. So trying to get too neurotic about, the exact amount of carbohydrate or whatever that you're taking, get a little bit unnecessary until you get into kind of the finer points of, managing your body composition, trying to get down to a, much lower body fat, that sort of thing. But in terms of somebody that's starting out, if you look at that, which was just basically, 3 meals a day, kind of eyeball portion sizes, the old, kind of a third of your plate of protein, a third of your plate of complex carbohydrates, a third of your plate of fibrous vegetables. That's a pretty good makeup for meal composition if you're just going to kind of eyeball it. And then, of course, that whole Body Life program was designed to sell supplements. It was designed to sell his EAS supplements. But at the same time, it was still a good approach, which was basically you had the 3 kind of portioned out meals per day, and then you had the 3 protein shakes on top of that. And so you could certainly do that with any protein supplement that you wanted to, or not use supplementation. It just is convenient for a lot of people to kind of rotate meal with shake to make sure that you're getting that good protein in every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day. So, that's in terms of kind of a fad diet. That's generally, I point a lot of people towards that because it's really, really easy to follow. It's not super, super rigid. And so if we're just looking to get somebody healthier, get them, feeding themselves adequately for barbell training, to get and manage their body composition, that's actually a pretty good approach. So in terms of the best, I'm great friends with Nathan Payton, who to me is the best nutrition guy in history. He does the nutrition for, I think, 5 of the world's strongest men have been, he does Martine's diet, Brian Shaw's diet. He did Travis Ortmeyer's back in the day. He works with a lot of strength athletes, a lot of power lifters, a lot of bodybuilders, that sort of thing. He's a good friend of mine. And he's to me, he's a wizard with nutrition. So if you want to go to the next level and have somebody really handle nutrition for you and really with a very high touch approach, Nathan Payton to me is the guy to go see. Thoughts on programming during a caloric deficit on a power program? Yeah, that can get pretty complex. I think what's worked for me past for sure, and with my client I've worked with, is you got to remember when you're in a caloric deficit, you're not going to be building a lot of new muscle mass unless you're a novice or unless you're really overweight. So if you're very overweight, you can go into a caloric deficit. You're still in an environment that's pretty anabolic when you're carrying a lot of fat tissue. So you can go into a deficit and still build some muscle mass. And if you're new to lifting, for sure, that's amplified even more. But if you're trying to, if you're not that overweight, let's say you're at 20% body fat and you want to get closer to 10 or 15% body fat, you got to realize during a cut like that, you're not going to be building new muscle mass. So the name of the game there is maintenance of muscle mass is all that you're trying to do. And what we know about maintenance is that strength muscle mass can be maintained with far less volume than it takes to build that same muscle. So one of the things that I make sure and have people do, and that I've done in the past that's worked best for me, is I just keep the volume much lower on a deficit than I would. I definitely don't agree with, when you're in a deficit, to just lighten the weights and do more volume. You got to remember, one, you're in a caloric deficit, almost always your carbohydrate intake is going to be lower, just because it's usually a necessity. In order, you have a finite amount of calories you can take in, and you have to allocate a big chunk of those to your protein intake, because you've got to have the protein available in order to maintain the muscle mass. So it doesn't leave a very big budget left for your energy calories, so to speak, your fat carbs. So your carbohydrate intake almost always comes down, just because you don't have a lot of extra calories in your budget. So the carbs are there basically to fuel your training, and if you don't have very many carbohydrates available in your caloric budget, you just don't have that much energy to train. So you want to use the amount that you have as efficiently as possible. So focus that on a few intense efforts, and what I mean by intense efforts, I don't mean going heavy for singles and triples and that sort of thing. That's usually a bad idea when you're in a caloric deficit to go super heavy. One, you're not going to make it's going to push your volume too low. But also you're opening yourself up to injury when you're in a depleted state and you're trying to go that heavy. So I typically don't recommend that guys go super low on the rep ranges and super heavy when they're in a caloric deficit, because again, when you're programming in a deficit, you are not, and this is, I have to hammer this home with guys so much, you are not trying to maintain your peak strength. You are going to lose your peak strength. If you go 20% body fat down to, let's say, 12% body fat, you are going to lose your top end strength. So the idea is not to try to maintain your 1 rep maxes. It's to maintain as much muscle mass as you can. And maintenance of muscle mass is different than maintenance of top end strength. Okay. So what we want to do to maintain that muscle mass, I'm going to have guys operate a lot more in the 5-8 rep range on their heavy compound movements, but with high effort sets. So that may just be like 1 or 2 all out sets in that 5 to 8 rep range. And that's enough probably to maintain your muscle mass. And you may do this multiple times per week and using different exercises. There's a lot of different ways to do it to make sure your volume doesn't get too low. So I don't necessarily mean 1 set per week, but at a given training session, you may not do more than just a handful of all out sets, kind of in that 5 to 8 rep range as a means to hang on to your muscle mass. So as opposed to dropping the weight really low and trying to do a bunch of volume. You're not going to have the calories or the carbohydrates available to do that. And I don't think it's as an effective way in order to maintain the muscle mass than trying to keep weight on the bar, but doing it with less volume. So that would be my thoughts on that. I have a lot of free time. I want to train every day. Any recommended routine? So I'm a novice. You have to have the discipline to train, and you have to have the discipline to rest. You know, it's just training 7 days a week is generally not good. So, you know, discipline yourself to take the rest days because you need them. That's when you're growing and you get stronger, when you're out of the gym, not when you're in the gym. The gym is a stimulus for getting stronger and adding muscle mass, but it's the recovery is equally as important. You need those off. You need to, you know, there's no reason to train 7 days a week. So you're just going to have to bastardize the program in order to make it work, and it won't work as well. So take those days off and use those to focus on your rest and your nutrition. Is there any demand strength coming from France? I have no idea. Some of you guys are posting some, I can't do like a programming consult on this. Some of you guys are posting some stuff with like your macros and your lifts and your training schedule. And like, I'm not going to go through that on a comments thing. If you want to email me, you can email me kingwoodstrength@gmail.com, and I'll point you in the right direction if you want some really detailed programming help, but not on Facebook comments. I'm a 43-year-old male to deadlift. He's a rank novice. I can't seem to teach him how to hold his back and extend. I've tried various cues, the exercise on the floor, nothing seems to work. Should I have him do RDLs to train the erectors, or would you take another approach? Yeah, that's a tough one. It's frustrating when you get a client that really, really, really struggles with that. And a lot of middle-aged men especially are the worst about that. So females pick it up right away. Usually, well, not all younger guys, but most younger guys pick it up but some of the older guys, they really have a problem with that. So there's a lot of different approaches to take. Doing the RDLs, that's actually not a bad approach. Also, you could call it an RDL, or you could also call it a deadlifting from the top. So a lot of guys can set their back easier when they're in a standing position, but not as well when they're bent over. You know, especially too, like kind of look at his positioning at the bottom. If belt, have him take it off right now. You know, the belt sometimes kind of impedes that sensation of what's going on right there. So take the belt off for now. Sometimes if the guy is more overweight, it's harder for his back just because he can't mechanically get into the right position. But sometimes you can have him do it. Start with him. If they can do it standing, start with him standing and then have him lower it down like you would like an RDL, and have him hold it, you know, hold it at the top, you know, kind of tactilely cue him at the top and say, look, how it is now, this is how we want it, the whole set. Make sure he understands that, and then have him, you know, initiate the movement by pushing the hips back, not bending over. Most guys, when they first start out, especially if they're not real athletically gifted, the way that they have an RDL interpreted in their head is to bend over and throw their torso forward rather than push their ass back. And so they have to be taught that the motion of an RDL is not to throw the torso forward, it's to push the ass back. So you can teach him that while holding his back in extensions, and sometimes doing it in reverse order like that clicks a little bit better for them, because they just have to, they can get it set at the top, and all they have to do is just not let it go. And then you just kind of watch the guy. And if you can see exactly where in the movement he's starting to lose it, and sometimes it's pretty close to the bottom. So it might be 1, 2, 3 inches off of the floor where he really starts to lose that back extension. And so what you might do temporarily is have the guy do all his deadlifts off like a 1 to 2, 3 inch block. So just kind of where if he at the lower limit of the movement, if he can't hold his back in extension at the very bottom, just elevate the bar up a little bit. I mean, you got to be patient with this kind of stuff. You know, build him some. Typically, as guys get stronger, too, their that kind of proprioceptive awareness and their abilities on bar get better. So you may have to just have him deadlift off like, say, 2-inch blocks for a while. And a lot of guys can set their back better if the bar is elevated for them just a little bit. So now, I don't mean the lifter standing on a 2-inch block. I mean the bar elevated on like 2-inch blocks or on really low pins out of the rack. But have him do something like that, and just build his base of strength on that over the course of a few weeks, and then try to take it down and see what happens. If you start him on 2-inch blocks, do that for weeks, then lower it down to a 1-inch block, 1-inch mat, do that for a while. And then, a couple weeks later, pull it off and see if you can pull him all the way from the floor. So that's the way that a lot of times that top down approach can work pretty well. So your instincts were probably right on that. Will you go more into the equipment part of the business? I don't know what that means, like selling equipment. No. Grip work has been pretty easy to do in quarantine. So any general thoughts on grip strength? Also with a 4-day split, would you recommend incorporating it into the upper body days or as their own mini workouts? I actually do if I do grip training for an athlete, whether it's like on an upper lower program, I typically do grip training on the lower body days because that's when we deadlift. So I don't like to, and typically the way I arrange things, I have guys do their upper body workout. Like if we're training 4 days a week, I have them do upper body Monday and Thursday, and then lower body Tuesday and Friday. So I don't like to do grip work the day before we deadlift. So the grip work would actually be on the lower body days when they're doing their deadlifting exercises. So grip work, I had to do. I never struggled with grip until I tore my bicep a couple of years ago. And after I got cleared to train. I started building my strength back up, and of course, it started with just building up the strength in the bicep and the arm overall and the shoulders and that sort of thing. But as I got kind of basically healed up and regained my muscle mass, the biggest limitation for me strength-wise was actually my grip strength in the arm that I had operated on. And actually, it's still that way. I'm about 2 years away from surgery, and I still haven't gotten 100% of my grip strength back in that hand. So I'm not sure it may come back, but I did quite a bit of grip work there in order to build that back up. And so I focused on 2 exercises, and I stole these from a lot of you guys know who Josh Bryan is. He does the whole Jailhouse Strong thing and all that. He's a buddy of mine. And I talked with him about, grip training, because he's big into grip training, trains a lot of strongmen and stuff like that. And so the 2 exercises he recommended to me that I did that I felt really helped. One was plate pinches. And the way that he had me do them was I didn't start with like 2 heavy plates, holding them together. Let me see if you guys can see. I didn't start with 2 heavy plates, holding them together with all my fingers and thumbs. I started with like 2.5s and 5s, and I was surprised how hard it was. It was really, really, really hard. And again, this was right after surgery. I was probably artificially weak. But basically what I would do is take like a couple of 5-pound plates, and you got to put them together so that you're holding on to the smooth side of the plates, and you're not cheating by holding on to like, the lip or whatever. But I would hold like 2 5-pound plates together for like 30 seconds with my forefinger and my thumb. And then I would rest for a little bit, and I would take them and I would hold them for 30 seconds with my middle finger and my thumb. And then I would do it with my ring finger and my thumb, and then my pinky and my thumb. And I would do like 30 seconds on each finger like that. And then I would do the whole hand again. So instead of doing like my entire, fist trying to hold on to something, I did 1 finger at a time like that. And that was really, really, really hard, but it worked really, really, really fast to build my grip strength back up. And you could feel all those fibers and muscles in your hands that you didn't even realize that you had were really, really singing to me while I was doing those. So that worked really, really well. The other thing that I did was I did suitcase deadlifts, just one side of the body. So that means you load up the bar, and then you're going to deadlift it. Instead of facing the bar, the bar is going to be next to you on the ground. So you're going to reach down and grab the bar right in the middle of it with just one hand. And I was doing sets of 3 to 5 reps on that just on one hand. And that's unbelievably hard. I think the first time I put it on there, I put like 135 on, and that was too heavy the first time that I did it. And so I think I started out, I had to lower it down to like 95 or something like that. But that challenges you in a lot of different directions to hold on to the bar like that. So I was doing the suitcase lifts on both sides. And then as I got stronger on those, what I noticed not only was my grip strength improving a hell of a lot, but it's a hell of a good exercise on the obliques. So I think for like heavy squatting and deadlifting, oblique strength is a good thing to train. And that was a really good exercise that I would end. I said twice a week, and I just linearly progressed them. And I kind of phased out of them, but those two things really, really helped my grip strength. Intermediate 4-day method. How long should the workouts be? How many accessory movements a day? Accumulated junk volume from too many accessories. Should I do less or more? I typically don't like training sessions to be more than about an hour and a half max. If we can get in and out in 60 to 90 minutes, I feel like that's optimal. I really don't like when I see guys that are, emailing me saying they had a volume day that 2 hours long, 2.5 hours long. That's really not a sustainable way to train. I really don't like that. I like to arrange things so you can get things done in about 90 minutes. I feel like if you're not getting things done in that period of time, there's probably time to be saved there. It's not necessarily that you need to do less work, that you just need to be more efficient in how you go about your training. You need to go get through your warm-ups faster, not do less warm-ups, just get through them faster. A lot of guys take way too long between their warm-ups, and then they way too long between their sets, between their work sets. So try to save yourself time on rest time, especially. You can save a lot of time if you're put your phone away. If you're a guy that's jacking around on your phone and stuff like that between warm-up sets and all that, you don't realize how much time that wastes. So put your phone away and get really, really focused. Blow through your warm-up sets. Get to your work sets, and then rest so that you can complete your work. But keep a timer going, and there's no reason for you to be standing around for 15 minutes between sets. And taking 2 and 3 hour workouts. Most of you guys, it's unnecessary. So rest time is where you can really save a lot of time. In terms of like a 4-day Texas method. So typically the way I like to arrange that is I like on a 4-day split, I like to do the I start with an intensity lift. So that would be like, a bench intensity and then press volume, and then like squat intensity and deadlift volume. I like to arrange it like that rather than trying to do all your volume on one day and all your intensity on another. That's a better way to kind of spread the stress out evenly over the course of the week. So when you're doing that, for the lower body, you probably need a lot less accessory movements as compared to the upper body, just because squats and lifts tend to be so thorough in how well they, and how well they train the lower body. So, and especially if you find yourself out of shape and not to get through your workouts very fast, the perfect thing to do on your lower body days is implement some like prowler or sled conditioning. So squat, deadlift, and then go push the sled or drag the sled. And you need to just get yourself in better shape and in better physical condition so that you can train at a little bit better pace and not drag the workouts on forever. The sled dragging, the sled pushing, prowler pushing, not only is it awesome conditioning tool, but it also acts as a very good hypertrophy stimulus for the legs without being killer on your lower body like some lower body assistance movements are if you do unilateral work or machine-based work and all that kind of stuff. The problem with a lot of that stuff is, man, it can really ramp up the fitness for a lot of people when you combine it with all the squats and deadlifts, and it's just very difficult to recover from. Whereas I find that the sled and the prowler, in addition to the squats and deadlifts, can actually make the recovery a little bit easier. So that's a perfect time to throw that stuff in. As far as the other movements, a lot of times I do chins and pull-ups on the squat and the deadlift day. It's a back exercise. It's an upper body movement, but it can kind of fit well in that pattern of like a squat, deadlift, and then do your chins or pull-ups. You're working your back a lot when you deadlift anyway, so it's fine to throw those in there. And then typically because the upper body, the press and the bench may need more assistance work. Things like dip or variations like we talked about the bench, dumbbell pressing, dumbbell incline pressing, dedicated tricep work, lying tricep extensions, stuff like that. You're typically at some point you're going to need that stuff to keep progressing on your bench and your press. You're going to need a little bit of assistance work. So what happens is I do kind of the bench and the press assistance work on those days, and then I might have guys do their chins, pull-ups, rows, that sort of thing on their squat and their deadlift day. What is the age of the oldest client that you are training? My oldest client is 88 years old. But I've had them in the gym in their 90s. But yeah, the oldest current client is 88. I've got a couple that are I've got a few that are in their early 80s. I've got a ton that are in their 70s, a lot in their 60s. But yeah, and actually Miss Jean, who's 88, she started with me when she was 80. So she's been training with me for 8 years. So super proud of her. If you were 45 years old, body weight 250, and had been basically squatting and deadlifting for sets of 5 for the last 5 years, what would your conditioning look like starting out? What exercises? How often would you build up to them? I've been doing short sprints and my joints hurts 2 weeks in. Yeah, sprint at 45, especially if they're full speed sprints, it's probably not the right place to start. Full speed sprints for guys that are, 35, 40 and beyond are not a good idea. I don't think. I think from a conditioning standpoint, you can get. So I don't know if you're calling sprints, if you're actually meaning like full speed, like you're running a 40 in high school. I do not recommend that. I think the risk is high for at the very least pulled hamstrings and things like that, but also guys blowing out Achilles tendon, stuff like that. I think from a conditioning standpoint, you can get the exact same benefit from running your sprints at 70 or 80% of what would be your top speed. So whether that's on the track or going to a field or something like that and going 50 to 100 yards, running a sprint, but definitely not all out max effort type of sprints. So you can stuff like that. They do take a toll. So even the half speed or quarter speed sprints, that's a big adjustment to the tissue. It's totally different than lifting weights. The more impact you're, at 45 and you're 250, so you're heavier, your joints, connective tissue and the muscles are not adapted to that. So it doesn't surprise me that the recovery is taking longer. You always just, with anything that you're trying to add, you always start easier and with a low volume. So if you overdo, just like with weights, if you overdo the intensity or the volume right out of the gate, it's going to be hard to recover from that. So probably with the sprints, probably you're overdoing the intensity a little bit. There's nothing wrong with, with starting with, walking. If you've been really, really inactive for a while, even just starting, 30-minute walking a day for a couple days a week, if nothing else, just to condition your feet and your ankles and your knees and stuff like that, where guys tend to have problems when they start doing a lot of conditioning. Just condition yourself to carry, your weight for longer periods of time like that, and then start to increase the speed that you're doing. I really am a fan of distance sprints for conditioning, especially for younger guys. When I used to work with MMA guys and judo guys and stuff like that, where we had to get them in really, really high levels of conditioning for their fights. That was one of my go-tos, was going to the track and doing 200-meter sprints, 400-meter sprints. Now with the younger group, I would have them go a little bit harder than a guy that's 45 and 250. But that's a hell of a way to get in shape, is mid-distance sprints. To me, there's nothing harder than 400-meter repeats. You think you're in shape until you start running 400-meter repeats on an incomplete rest. So that is a good way to get in shape. But also, I'd say, in your situation, build up to that. I love sled dragging. I think sled dragging is a great way to get introduced to a little bit harder form of conditioning. You start with just some walking, and then you find a place to drag a sled, and just going anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes. Start with a lightweight, just kind of going back and forth, whether it's in a parking lot or whatever. And then there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can work with heavier loads, go shorter distances with longer rest periods. You can do lighter weights, but relatively unburdened. So sled dragging is great. Next step up from there is doing stuff like pushing the prowler is basically the next from there. Pushing is hard. If you guys have never worked with a sled, pushing a prowler is far harder than dragging a sled. So working with a prowler, is the kind of the next thing from there. And, then maybe working up into doing those sprints at the track if you're really looking to get in shape. But for most people who are trying to get in shape, just kind of in a general sense, and to help them, get through their workouts better, that sort of thing, I think sled dragging is really, really it's really easy to recover from too. Even if the individual workout is hard, the sled dragging is really easy to recover from comparatively to a lot of the other protocols you can do. And again, it builds up leg mass. So if you're progressive with it and the amount that you do and the weight that you do, it's a good hypertrophy stimulus as well as a conditioning stimulus. So I would definitely look into maybe some sled dragging. And then there's other stuff you can do too. I know people's aversion to sleds and prowlers and that sometimes is just the logistical challenge of I don't have a sled, I don't have a prowler. Even if I did, I don't have a place to push one. If you're blessed with a gym with a big turf field or something, that's a different story, but a lot of us don't have that type of access. So like I've got a parking lot in the gym where my gym is at that hardly anybody uses. So the only downside here is being in Texas, it's a lot of times it's 105 degrees outside and I don't want to kill my clients. But when the weather's okay, we do all that stuff out back. We do a lot of sleds and prowlers and stuff. But if you don't have access to that, the rower is good. Airdyne bikes, things like that are good. You can do them. You can do HIIT intervals. You can also just do steady state, 20, 30, 40 minutes at a time, that sort of thing. And it's pretty low impact. It doesn't beat up your joints and your lower back and everything like running will. Have you worked with soccer players with knee issues? Yeah. I'm wondering what's your experience in working with them to increase leg and hip strength to resolve knee issues. Getting stronger typically helps. I don't do anything special for them. It's just teaching them how to squat correctly, building hamstrings in a lot of ways. So that's really it. I don't do anything special with soccer players or females that I wouldn't do with anybody else that has an issue. The first step is to teach them the proper mechanics and then get them progressively stronger on it. And usually if it doesn't alleviate it completely, it usually helps. Let's see. Any advice on squat grip in respect to avoiding shoulder, elbow, bicep tendonitis? Affects bench and press performance. Yeah, it's a really common problem in low bar squatting. So there's a lot of other stuff here I'm not going to read, but okay. So basically with the squat grip and whether elbow, shoulder, bicep, that sort of thing, it can come from a couple of different places. One is just to make sure that you don't have the bar too low. A lot of guys will get the bar too low, and what happens is they wind up carrying a lot of the bar weights rather than distributed on their back. So if the bar too low, there's a natural shelf on your back when you've got your shoulder blades back and you get the bar on there, especially if you've got some meat on the back, there's a natural shelf where that bar will sit. And if you get the bar down too low, it's below that shelf and it will have a tendency to want to slide down your back. And so there's two things that guys do to accommodate for that, both of which are wrong. Is one, if the bar is too low and it's feeling like it's going to roll down their back, they either distribute the weight in their hands, so it's not all on their back. They're holding a lot of the weight in their hands, and so that will a lot of times manifest itself in shoulder issues, because you can kind of imagine that cranking back a little bit more on your shoulder, over the course of several heavy to 5, that's a lot of torque on the shoulders that you don't want. So, or what they do is they bend over way too much, because in order to get that bar to keep it over the midfoot when it's too low, they'll have to bend over way too much. So both of those things are not preferred. So you want to make sure, one, that the bar is not low. So we want a low bar squat, but people often don't recognize that the difference between a high bar squat and a low bar squat is not much. It's not a huge gap on the back. It's only a matter of a couple of inches. But you have to remember that couple of inches that is moving up or down is relative to the middle of the foot, which is a very small point. So 2 or 3 inches one way or the other is actually, may not look like that much on the back, but relative to that small point of your foot where your balance point is at, it's a pretty big increase. So make sure that is there. The other thing, I see guys do this all the time when they come into the gym for form checks, is they have a tendency to want to set their hands on the bar first. So they think that, okay, this is the correct squat, the correct grip width is right here. And so they take a grip on the bar and then they try to go underneath and get under their hands already in place, and it's too tight. They can't get it there. So get your hands out further. If it's hard to get in position, get your hands in further, then get underneath the bar, get the bar set where it needs to be on your back, and then get the hands in as tight as you can without being severely uncomfortable. The primary, so when we look at bar placement and squat and the width of a squat grip, bar placement is far and away more important than the width of your hands. It's more important to have the bar in the right spot than it is to have your hands at some kind of arbitrary distance. So we want to have the hands in tight because it helps us keep the shoulder blades retracted. But if you can keep the shoulder blades retracted and the bar is in the right spot on your back, you can have your hands out a little bit more, and that'll alleviate some of that elbow and bicep pain. You don't have to keep your hands in as tight as they absolutely can be, because your elbows, your forearms, they're under a lot of pressure when you're holding it like that. And that over time, if you're doing a lot of squat frequency, is probably what's contributing to that inflammation. So just loosen your grip up a little bit by letting it slide out a little bit without loosening up your upper back. Okay, so when we widen the grip out, we keep our upper back tight. We don't widen the grip and at the same time relax our upper back. We don't want to be squatting with a loose upper back. We want to have our upper back nice and tight up under the bar. So if you can do that and you keep the bar spot, you can afford to widen your hands out a little bit, and that should give you some relief. The other thing you can do as far as affecting your you have to reorganize your training temporarily to not bench right after you squat. You can bench first if you want to, and then go squat. So you can certainly do that. It's nothing necessarily magical about squatting first. You could bench first and then go squat, or you might have to organize it more in terms of like a 4-day split, where you say you bench on Monday and Thursday and do your squat Tuesday and Friday. Might cut your frequency down on your squats a little bit, but you might need the reduced frequency right now to let some of that inflammation dissipate, and that avoid the problem of, if your elbows get inflamed from the squats, at least you have a day off afterwards to let them kind of heal up rather than going right into the bench press. My 13-year-old daughter complains that her knees hurt while squatting and bends over with her torso almost horizontal in order to reach depth, even with only body weight. Do you have any suggestions to correct this? I'm trying to get her form corrected before. Yeah, actually, one, you got to remember, 13-year-olds are their hormone state is different from one 13-year-old to the next, so they're not all the same. And the more hormonally she is like a child, they tend to be less mechanically proficient. So when you're training really, really young kids, I've got young kids. My son is 10, and I with them in the gym a little bit, but their form is not really repeatable. I mean, you can get them into the right position and get them to do the right stuff, but they're going to have they're really, really pliable, really hypermobile, especially girls. And they're like, it's like training Gumby. they're not rigid enough to really hold their mechanics together that well. So there's some expected kind of, play in the form like that. But if it's really, really bad, certainly with a young kid, if you're doing something that hurts, stop. Because the worst thing you can do is burn them out on training and get them to not like it. And if something's not, I mean, it may be your fault as a coach or whatever the circumstances may be. If a kid at 13 years old is already starting to experience pain due to their training, then change your approach. Do something different or change, to give her a break or whatever, because the worst thing you can do is take a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid and train them like they're an 18-year-old kid and burn them out on it so that by she's 15 or 16, she hates it and doesn't want anything to do. So if you don't make it fun for them, if it's not enjoyable, and if they dread it, that sort of thing, you're gonna ruin them early. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind her age. But in terms, I'd have to look at, in terms of what's going on. It's hard to diagnose form issues in this format, but kind of the same thing where I was talking to the guy earlier about changing the position where you start from. So if having a really hard time deadlifting and getting set up at the bottom, change your approach to having him get set up at the top and then teach it the opposite way. Instead of teaching from the bottom up, teach it from the top down. Do the same thing on the squat and use a box squat. So if she can't get the bottom position of a squat right, start her on the box at the bottom. So her rep begins while she's seated on the box. And then you put her feet in the right position. You put her knees in the right position. You angle her torso at the right position. You get her back set. And then you tell her, this is the correct bottom position of a squat. Now stand up, and have her stand up. And then have her return to that same seated box position and pause down there and do everything real slow with no weight. And just have her do the box squats. And having that cue down there of a place to sit so she doesn't go too deep. And it normalizes the form a little bit better to have a box there. Once she gets a hang of the box squat, then maybe go to a pair of dumbbells, and have her hold the dumbbells on her shoulders at first, and then just to get her a little bit of resistance, and then have her do that, and if she can do that well, without bending over too much and that sort of thing, then, progress her to a light bar, and probably for her age, I mean, a 13-year-old girl is probably not going to start with a 45-pound bar, unless she's a more advanced athlete. But you need to have a lighter training bar, something like a 15-pound training bar or something like that. The 15-pounders can be a little too light. The weight doesn't give them enough feedback, but still 25, 30 might be the sweet spot. So you need to definitely start her with something light, and don't progress and wait until she's got the form mastered. And then just don't overdo it with the amount of reps that she does or days of the week. And when you see that she's starting to lose, and it's not fun anymore, then, let her go. Come back to it another day. When cycling from higher volume to lower volumes, is it best to run things out until you stall, or just a set amount of time? No, I don't like to. I like to change things up before we have hard stalls. From a kind of a fatigue management standpoint, I don't like to wait until the wheel fall off until I make a change on something. I don't like to keep going until a guy starts missing a bunch of reps and things like that. Make changes. So because it's hard to recover from that. And then the problem is whatever changes you make in the next phase of training, whether it's just an adjustment to the current program you're on, or a kind of a wholesale switch to something new, if you go into that with an absolute ton of fatigue, it screws up the initiation of the new program. So you want to keep there's no reason to go till you have missed weights and all that kind of thing. I mean, missed weights are going to happen in the gym from time to time, but I wouldn't make that we're going to go until we start weights and then we make changes, because at that point, the wheels have already started to kind of fall off in terms of fatigue and that sort of thing. So that's something that's way easier for me to manage in the gym than it is with, say like working with line clients, just because you're there with them all the time. You can see workout to workout what's happening. You're like, okay, things are starting really hard. Fatigue starting to build up. Let's go ahead and make, I can see within the next workout or two, we're going to having maybe some performance regression. So we're going to go ahead and make some changes now, whatever those changes are, before the wheels come off. It's a little bit harder to do if you're programming for yourself and you're more inexperienced. or if you're programming for somebody online where you're watching their videos and that sort of thing. But online programming and in-person programming and in-person coaching, as someone that does a lot of both, they are not the same thing at all. And it's much harder to manage these things in an online environment than when you're with somebody in the gym all the time. So when in doubt, I usually tell people you're usually not wrong to be on the conservative side. If a lot of times that one extra workout's not going to make you, but it might break you. So just kind of, and the more advanced you get, I think the more true that is, because the more fatigue you're capable of getting and the longer it takes to recover from a hard bout of overtraining. I don't just mean fatigue from a workout, but serious overtraining, which is the result of repeated, high fatigue bouts over and over and over again without a break. Once you kind of push into that overtraining status, it's hard to recover from, and the whatever gains you get are generally not worth the cost of lost training time. I'm deadlifting 6 sets of 5 at 60% times per week, increasing my weight every week. Do you think my 1 RM deadlift will go up after this with no squatting? High volume deadlift, I know this is against common wisdom. I don't know, it might, but it seems like an inefficient approach to me. So it seems like a lot. You can try it and see, I don't know how long it's not 6 sets of 5 3 times a week is not sustainable. So however long you're planning on doing this for, all you can do is test it at the end and see what happens. Stuff like that works. Super high volumes for short periods of time sometimes works. And then guys go back to it. And it's like, 10, 20 years ago, kind of when all the strength training stuff first kind of let loose on the internet. A lot of you guys are too young to remember this, but a lot of these like old Russian powerlifting programs and stuff were everywhere. And they were like super high volume, super high frequency squat and deadlift stuff. And there's a million of them. I'm sure they're arrived around somewhere. I don't know. I don't use them, but, guys would do those. And so you would have different results. Some people would use them and they, like a lot of people, they would now 60% isn't that much. So, it's not really, to me, it's not much of a strength stimulus, but it's, you have guys that got these like really, really profound training effects from these super high volume programs, and they would get it once and then they would try to go back on it again and it didn't work. Like they would hit a wall that second time, or they would just hit the wall the first time. They get about halfway through a protocol like that and it wouldn't work. So again, it was like I was going back and talking about earlier, in this broadcast, where if you pick an approach that's really, really far on one end of the spectrum, there's a chance that you get a really, really profound training effect from it, but there's also a chance that you hit a brick wall. At 6 sets of 5 at 60%, to me, that seems really conservative on the weight side of things. Seems like a lot of work, potentially not a lot of return. I think you could up the a little bit and bring down. I'm biased towards being more efficient with the training, so that seems like, again, it seems like a lot of work for potentially maybe not a lot of progress. Oh, good question. What is the first thing you look for when analyzing the past program of a brand new client under your supervision and determine a need to change? Well, first thing I ask is, what are you doing right now? What does the last 6 months or so look like? I don't need, a lot of guys will send me like the past 10 years. It's like, no, I just need like the past 6 months or so. And I'll look at what have you been doing the last 6 months? And is it working? And if it's not working at all, or if they're regressing or having a lot of recovery problems, then I'll look at that. It kind of goes back to what I was just saying. I'll see, are they operating at one spectrum or the other? And if so, it's usually pretty obvious what the problem is. So you can the guy and says, hey, I've been doing this program for 6 months, and I'm really, really burned out, tired all the time, I'm sore all the time, my weights are not going up. And I look at the approach and I see he's squatting 4 days a week, he's benching 4 days a week, he's deadlifting 3 days a week, he's got all this accessory and GP work and all this stuff. And I go, you're overtraining. So the fix for that is easy. We're gonna bring the volume way down, probably keep the intensity down for a little bit of time until he gets recovered, but then we're going to change to more of an intensity-based approach with a more middle of the road type of volume. And obviously the volume approach wasn't working, or he was doing it too long without a break. So high volume can work, but you have to factor in deloads in there. And a lot of guys don't. So they just run with this never ending climbing volume, and you can't do that. High volume only works when it's done cyclically. So high volume can work, but it still has its cycles where there's periods of where you step back, deload, operate at a lower volume, build it back up over time to a higher volume. That's the thing with higher volume, is you have to understand how to cycle it appropriately. You can't just stay with higher volume in perpetuity. It doesn't work. So you'll burn out. So I'll look at it. So that in a case like that, it's really, really easy. We just do the opposite of what he's been doing. I may look and see, is there a lot of excess we can cut out? Has he been doing a lot of accessory type work or whatever? We may cut some of that stuff so we can get back to the basics, just get back to see if we can make progress with, kind of that minimal effective dose type concept, and get a bit more efficient with our training, and then re-add stuff later on as we need it. But sometimes a guy gets to doing so much stuff, it's very clouded and murky and hard to see what's working, what's not, what's just junk, what's effective. So you got to kind of pull it all out and start over. The other end of the spectrum might be, I get a guy that's, he's been training and I see his program, it's really, really low volume, low frequency. He's only lifting twice a week. He's only doing like 1 or 2 work sets per exercise. And he says, well, I've been doing this for 6 months. I really haven't made any progress. It's pretty obvious. We're not going to take his volume down further because he's already doing minimal volumes and frequency. So we say, all right, hey, you need more work, man. You're not making enough. You're not doing enough to disrupt, kind of that homeostasis that we talk about. You're not doing enough work. So we're going to need to add some more in. We need more volume, more frequency, that sort of thing. We'll adjust intensity accordingly. We're going to get him going on an approach that's adding more work in. Sometimes it's just something different. So it's not that usually it is a case of a little less and a little more. So you either need to take some stuff out or put some more in. But sometimes also just if you look at a guy, and he's just been doing sets of 5. Like we had a guy earlier, in one of the questions was, I've been doing sets of 5 for like 5 years. Well, maybe, if you're stagnant, it might be time a little bit. Sets of 5 on the big 4, that's perfect for a novice. It's perfect for an early intermediate. But once you've been training for a while, different rep ranges, different exercises, there's lots of different calls, and your body will need something a little bit different in order to keep adapting. So it's not just change for the sake of change. It's not just throwing in variety because we get bored or the muscle confusion or whatever. It's not necessarily that, but there is a reality to the fact that the body will get used to the same stimulus thrown at it over and over and over and over again. So there's changes in volume and intensity, frequency, and then there's changes in stimulus. So it might be, exposing the guy to some new exercises and new rep ranges and things like that. Intermediate guys who will hold, and let me look at the time real quick. Okay, we're at about 1:19. I'm going to go for an hour and a half. So I'm going to go for about 10 more. I'll answer as many as I can there. For intermediate guys getting back soon, 8+ week layoff, I'm wondering how LPing back up and transition to intermediate programming should go. I'm going to actually, I haven't done it yet. Rip asked me a couple weeks ago to write an article for this. I'm going to write an article on that, and it's going to go up on the Starting Strength website. I repost it on my blog too, but I'm going to put it on the. It'll go up live. Starting Strength here at some point. I need to get to it. Similar question to above. Can you expect to get your pre-layoff Texas method weights using LP? Maybe. We've had a couple of cases of guys that have done that before, where they ran a novice kind of ran its course. They go to intermediate level programming for a while. They experience a long layoff for whatever reason, and then they get back into training after a few months, and they decide to restart on novice linear progression again, and they wind up having this amazing run of progress. Takes them far and away past anything they've ever done before. Sometimes that happens just with that kind of resensitization from getting away from the weight. That's common. I mean, that happens in advanced lifters and everything too, for not just using the novice program, but where after a really long period of deconditioning, and then getting back into it, the stimulus sometimes is very profound, and you can definitely slingshot back up past weights where you had been at before because you kind of maybe constantly dealing with this underlying fatigue, underlying kind of overreaching that's kind of always present when you're very consistent with your training. So I typically don't recommend an approach where you take months out of the gym, on a consistent basis. But sometimes, time to time, we see that with the guys. I experienced that with myself when I was out I took a long layoff after I had my surgery, just because of the surgery, but just a lot of other stuff too. Just being burnt out on the gym and that sort of thing. And you had a period there of many months where I didn't train at all, and I got back into it. Of course, I was weak as hell when I started, but it didn't take me long to get back up to my old PRs. Okay. In practical programming, when discussing the dynamic effort method, I believe you use 65, 70, and 75% as the starting percentages for dynamic effort without resistance. What percentages would you start with when using accommodating resistance? Do you calculate the percentage based off of the top end weight, the average? Also, how much of the weight should be accommodating resistance versus straight weight? Asking for raw lifters. Yeah. So I do like for dynamic effort work, when I first start somebody with it, and we always just use straight weight. But over time, the use of bands, I think, can be effective. For raw lifters, I only like a light band tension. I don't think there's really any reason for a raw lifter to overload a squat or a bench or a deadlift, but certainly a squat and a bench. I don't feel like there's really a need to overload that lift by using a ton of heavy band tension with a really light bar weight, just because most lifters are going to be their weakest out of the bottom of the lift, so that the bottom of the squat. It's not like gear. So for a lot of you guys that don't know about all this, the really, really heavy band work is designed for guys that were competing. It's such a big deal anymore, but it was in the 90s, early 2000s. Most powerlifting was done in squat suits and bench shirts, which do a lot of the work for the lifter at the bottom of the mat. So the bench shirt gives you a lot of rebound out of the bottom, and a squat suit gives you a lot of rebound out of the bottom, so that the work really, really started for the lifter at the top. So he had to have a lot of strength to be able to hit those huge numbers. So they started training with really, really heavy band tensions to mimic what would be happening in the suits and the shirts. For a raw lifter, there's really no point in doing that. There's really no point in overloading the top of it to that degree. But a light band tension can be really, really good for helping with speed and just for a different effect of altering the load. So the light band tension would be like a mini band or a monster mini band, depending on who you buy from. And typically when you do that, you're going to lower your percentages down to around like 50 to 60%. So that means 50 to 60% of your 1 rep max on the bar. And so if you're a 500-pound squatter, you start with like 250 pounds of bar weight, and then add the light mini bands or monster mini bands to that. And then with everything with the dynamic effort sets, you're using bar speed as your gauge. So if you can move, so the percentages are a guideline, but they're not absolute. So you put the weight on your back, you squat it for a double or triple. If you've got decent speed bar, then you're probably in the neighborhood of being right. The weight turns into a slow grind, too heavy. So the point of the dynamic effort method is to accumulate a metric shit ton of volume without a drop in bar speed, and so that there's less fatigue from a whole lot of volume. So it's a little bit different approach of accumulating volume for a more advanced guy. And so you're going to use that bar speed on there. So if you put 50% on plus light bands and you squat it fast, but it doesn't feel like effort, probably put a little bit more weight on. So there's kind of that middle ground there where you should have no trouble moving the bar fast, provided that you're maximally trying to move it fast. So if you're moving it fast with a half-assed effort, it's too light. Okay. But if you're putting everything you have into it and it's moving slow, it's probably too heavy. So you want to be able to kind of, like Bill Starr used to say, you want to be able to make the plates rattle at the top. Okay, but you want to have to work in order to make that happen. Okay, so I can make 135 rattle at the top without having to squat it very hard. Okay, but you put on 315, 405, you get a heavier weight on there, still make the plates rattle, but you have to try to make it rattle. Okay, so that's the way that with dynamic effort for it to work. The bands can be useful in keeping from slowing down at the top so that you're accelerating all the way through the lift. I also think that there's some muscle building effects from the bands, just from the overloaded eccentric. The way I teach dynamic effort is I don't do the whole rep fast. I do a controlled eccentric with a pause and a super fast and explosive concentric. So, and I think that tempo is really, really good for lifters to build muscle mass. And I think that the bands actually help to build muscle mass in a more advanced lifter, because I think the bands added to that eccentric component actually really, really stressful to the muscles in a good way. So, so that's, 65 to 75% is a pretty good ballpark. I run the conjugate program in my online coaching club, and I waive the weights. Most coaches do a 3-week wave. So we're like 65, 70, 75. I actually do a 5-week wave. I start at 60 and I go all the way to 80. So we go 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, and then we have to cycle back over at 60. The reason being is I just like to expose the guys to a little bit of work on both ends. I like at 60%, the weights are moving really fast. So they're getting a true dynamic, type of explosive effort. Plus it kind of deloads the weight a little bit from their volume work. Allows a little bit of recovery to happen. And then by the 5th week though, we're pushing like 10 doubles or 10 triples at 80%. And that actually is some work. So the guys have to really, they have to really work to move that. And that's that 60 to 80% is usually without bands. I told them if they want to add bands, they can put it on the 60 and 65%. But at 70, 75, and 80%, we're not using bands and all that. That's just straight weight. Putting bands on 80% is not going to be speed work. I can tell you that. And so that's the way that we will typically do that. And so they get some exposure to both. They get the really heavy, 10 or 12 doubles at 80%, which is pretty tough to do on short rest period too. So you're moving these weights not in a state of full recovery. And then the next week we cycle back to 60%. So it allows them to offload a little bit. And that just gives them some exposure to volume work kind of at all ends of the spectrum. Any thoughts about mixed approaches for intermediate trainees? Currently, my squat and press seem to respond best to a volume and intensity approach, and my bench and deadlift to more of a heavy light approach. Yeah, it's fine. Use whatever. You don't have to. There's absolutely no rule that says that you have to have lift programmed exactly the same way. So some lifts, like a lot of guys will find out that their bench requires a lot more volume and frequency than say their deadlift. So there's a, and you also have to look too at how one lift affects other. So when you look at say programming deadlift volume and deadlift frequency, you can't judge that independently of squat volume and squat frequency because there's so much overlap there. If you're doing a shitload of squats, per week, if your squat volume is very high or your intensity is high and you've got a lot of very stressful squat programming going on, that's going to affect your deadlift programming. So you might have to bring the deadlift down a little bit. And so you have to look at the way that these things affect each other. But yeah, there's absolutely no reason why you have to get guys a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this too, is you look at a program on paper and we like everything to look very symmetrical and very even and very uniform. And we like to have, but it often doesn't work like that. I mean, it may be that the press and the lift require two completely different approaches, and the squat and the bench require two completely different approaches. I mean, there may be some similarities between lifters, but, some guys, they have to train the press a lot harder with a lot of volume and a lot of intensity, where we have guys doing, 5 sets of 5, on their press one day of the week, then a light set in the middle, and then like 10 singles, on Friday for their press, where that's not going to work for the deadlift, or the squat. That might be way overkill on those types of movements because you're using more muscle mass, you're using heavier weight, it's more stressful. The squat and the deadlift overlap much more than, say, the press and the bench overlap. You've got all the fatigue that builds up in the low back you have to monitor. So you have to pay it. The most valuable tool that you have in your programming toolkit is your own feedback. Okay. Your own feedback from Respond to different training approaches is the most valuable piece of information you have. The most valuable piece of information is not practical programming. It's not blog articles. It's not what any coach or lifter has said. The most valuable tool that you have is your own experience under the bar. So your N1 matters to you. Okay. It doesn't matter to, we always talk about, well, N1, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters to you. Okay. It doesn't necessarily matter on applying your program to the clients that you train. So the way that I train, not how I train all my clients, although I may learn some things from training myself that I apply to my clients. But just because something worked for me, it's ludicrous to think that that approach is going to work for all the clients that walk through my door, or just because this approach works for this coach advocates this, or this coach advocates that, or I read this in this article. That's all good stuff to put in there, but you have to filter it out again through training experience. So if hey, I can't volume and intensity in the same week on this lift, man, I hit a brick wall in 2 or 3 weeks. That's gold. That's golden information that you got to hang on to. Okay, and know how to program that way. Okay, and the same thing for shut up, dog won't be quiet. So the same thing. With your other lifts, it's if you do better with heavy light, I can do one stressful, session per week on this lift. And the other day, I just got to kind of keep it easy with active recovery. Then that's good. With that, regardless of what anyone says. Okay. I'm going to answer one more question. Well, it looks like we're about out of questions, or I've scrolled them all. So, okay. So I'm going to call it a day on the Q&A. So I appreciate all you guys that tuned in. Hope it was full. I'm going to shamelessly plug my own stuff now. So if you want to go to my website, it's andybaker.com, and basically all my services and products are there. So got programming templates there. Want to sign up for one-on-one coaching, you can go there. If you want to join my a lower cost option for online coaching, you can join the Baker Barbell Club online. So if you have a question, feel free to email me. If you're not sure what product or service is right for you, just email me. It's kingwoodstrength@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And then head over to my Instagram at Baker Barbell and give me a follow there. And if you want to look at some of the t-shirts I just had printed up, you can take a look there as well. So guys, thank you very much. Talk to you soon.